Welcome to Artscape. I'm your host, Bill Harris. We have an exciting show for you today, at least for me it is. We've had a lot of painters and potters and things like that on the show, but we've never had an author/poet on the show. Today with us is Lynda Allen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm
Thanks for being
excited
here.
to be the first author you
Yeah.
interview.
So now, would you call yourself an author/poet or a poet/author?
I think mostly writer is
You're
the
a
word I
writer.
go with, yeah.
Okay.
Because I write lots of different forms. I've written children's stories too, so.
Right. Now, okay, so we had you on the show because you recently published a book of poetry.
Yes.
But you also have done a novel.
Yes.
And a children's book. So how did you get into writing? Because it sounds like it was like not a very straight path to get into.
No, it wasn't at all. In fact, it's not my educational background, though liberal arts is my educational background, but writing was not my focus. It was broadcasting communications. The writing started for me actually really very suddenly. It was a strange process. I had done some writing through school, through my graduate degree in film and video, writing screenplays. And that was about all the writing I had done. I had never written a poem before in my life before 2003.
Wow.
I was working on a screenplay. I need to have a creative outlet. It has to be. And I was working on a screenplay for Project Greenlight, the second year that they were offering that contest. And I submitted it, and it got chosen for the top 250, which was very exciting.
Yeah.
And then it didn't go any further than that, but a lot of the feedback that I received was this would make a better novel than a movie. And that's the one that turned into Sight to See. That just
We got to
was
go back a
released.
little bit because at this time you're more in filmmaking, right? Or you're,
Yes.
Right.
It took me a while to come to terms with the fact that I'd always been a storyteller in one form or another, and it was just visual to start with. I had
Just a
worked
different medium now.
Yes, exactly. And then I was at home with my children, and I needed an outlet, so I was writing. And then about a year, it was a year and a half after September 11th happened that the poetry began. I had sort of carried around this sorrow, this collective sorrow. It felt like that wasn't entirely mine, though some of it was mine, very empathetic, and it had created this wall within myself, that sorrow that because I didn't want to feel it, it was so intense. And I knew there was something off in my life, and so I went through this process with a friend of mine called spiritual discernment process, and there's 12 steps to it, because there's always 12 steps to everything. And it's basically you start with a question. It's a process of meditation, and you meditate on different questions, and it begins with coming up with a question to ask yourself. And my question was, what is mine to do? And you fill in the blank. And my question ended up being, what is mine to do to be happy? And so first I had to come to terms with the fact that I wasn't actually happy, which was a longer process.
Yeah.
But the answer to the question that came through the meditation process was such a surprise, because it was just one word. It was right.
Well, how did you come up with that? It was just out of the top of your head?
Yeah, it was just you meditate on the questions, and I worked with the person who led me through the process. We just spent a few hours.
That had to be
working on it
shocking
together.
because you weren't a writer.
Exactly. I said to her, I have no idea what that means. I don't write. Other than that screenplay, I wasn't really writing. And the next day,
Now, was
I
it something
started
about
to
the
write.
screenplay that when you did it, you really connected with it? It was
Well,
really
it was
exciting?
a really fascinating process for me, the screenplay, actually, because there was all sorts of interesting coincidences along the way and things that just met up. And it was a fascinating story. And that was where I learned to listen, which is what writing is to me. I listen really well. And I really felt like this character, Dawn, came and sat beside me and told me her story, and I just wrote it down. And so, yeah, I think I learned a lot about listening through that process to this other part, the spirit of something that would come and share the story. And for poetry, that became listening to myself, listening to my soul speak to me, really. And so, yeah, the very next day I started to write, and it was an amazing process. I had never written a poem.
So the next
before
day
that
you just start writing poetry?
I wouldn't call it poetry at first.
Right.
Really, the very first thing I wrote was called The Dam That Sorrow Built, and it was really just me spewing and letting that wall come down.
Real cathartic.
Yes, very
experience.
cathartic, yes. Well, and I write a lot about, I don't want to say tragedy, but events in the world that move me.
Maybe events that don't necessarily
express.
happen to you, but events
Yes,
you're witnessing.
but I can feel them, and I can feel the sorrow of them and the pain of them, and so I move that through words. But the part for me that's always a surprise is how it comes around to healing. I'll get to the end of a poem and be like, wow, I had no idea we were going there. But it always ends up in a place of healing from starting in a place of pain.
Right. So the early, they're just writings. You're just getting things out.
Yes.
And at what point do you start, forming them into poems?
Well, that was hard for me to find the courage to call them poems, because I had never written poetry. I didn't study poetry. I, for much of my life, didn't understand poetry.
Right.
So it was really a challenge for me to claim that for myself, to call them poems. So it took a while before.
So now did you go and study like what actually is a poem?
No, I didn't. They just
Are you
show
sure
up
they're
and
poems?
I just write them down. Yes, I'm certain that they're poems. Some of them. Some
Right.
of them I'm not always sure.
Now,
But yeah.
now how does this exactly work? Do you just spew out a bunch of ideas and then start pushing it into the form of a poem?
No. For me, and it's interesting because one of the films I worked on was about women musicians, and I talked to them a lot about their writing process. And there were several of them that were like, I write it all at once, and that's it. If I don't get it all down, it's gone. And that's how it is for me with poetry, is that the words come all at once. If I'm not in a place where I can sit and write, I have to at least write a phrase of it down that will bring me back to it. But it comes all at once, and I have to write really fast.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Just to keep up with the
With
thoughts.
the flow of the words,
So now,
yeah.
do you go back and is there a lot of rewrites or?
Honestly, no. There are some, and there are certain poems that
grammars
take
and-
more than others. But no, there's not a lot of rewriting for me, which I don't know if that's okay or not. You know, but that's how it works for me. The words just come, and they come very quickly. They'll wake me up in the middle of the night sometimes. That used to happen a lot more at the beginning of the process. That I couldn't go to sleep until I had written it down.
So now you're writing at home. You know, you get these out. How do you know when it's okay to show them, and who do you show them to?
Well, at first, my friend Christine was the one who read everything. I mean, she got everything that I've ever written and would provide feedback, but mostly just encouragement. At first, the only place that I shared them was through the church I was attending at the time, and they were very supportive, and I shared a few in the services.
Now I know any artist like myself, when you start in early on, it's hard to know if you're getting good feedback, because a lot of times you'll maybe have friends that are very supportive, and you just don't know, are they giving me really what I need, or are they just being good friends?
Yes.
So
it's very
I
challenging.
mean, I guess you got to just know, hey, how did you know that it was that good, or that it was good enough that you could just start showing it to anybody who wasn't a friend?
Honestly, I think what encouraged me the most was to watch people's reaction to them. I very much am a person who comes from my heart, and when I would watch people's reactions or hear people's reactions to the poems, it always touched them heart to heart.
Right.
And that's how I knew they were not right, but they were connecting with people.
Right, and that was
that
the
for
main.
me is that's
Right.
the words are meant to be shared, and they're meant to touch one heart at a time.
Right.
So.
Well, great. You know, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to have Lynda read some of her poetry from her book Illumine, and we'll be right back with Artscape. Welcome back to Artscape, and we are here with poet Lynda Allen, and you have your book Illumine here, where you're going to pick up a poem to read from. How important is someone's interpretation to your poetry? For example, like if, let's say you read it, and maybe I read something differently into it than what was your intention. Is that a good or bad thing, or is it like that with everybody? Everybody has sort of their own interpretation?
I think it's a wonderful thing, actually. I find it fascinating. And I've had people like my father, who's not really into poetry, ask me, well, I don't really understand what this means. And it means whatever it means to you.
Right.
Obviously, it meant something to me when I wrote it, but I don't have any attachment to it meaning the same thing to you. I think it touches people in different ways. And I think that there are certain poems that will touch you a different way today than they will next year.
Right.
It just depends on where you are. So
if I was to ask you, what was that about? What was that poem about?
I wouldn't tell you.
You wouldn't, because it would ruin it, right? It would.
Yeah, well, I can't tell you what it means to you.
Right.
I could tell you what it meant to me when I wrote it.
Right.
But I.
Now, is that true 100% of the time? All poems, in your opinion, feel that way? Like, or are there poems that it's specific about your experience that you want to share?
Well, I think that, for me, they're very specific in what they meant in my life, and I think they're universal themes that will mean the same thing on a certain level to people. If it's about relationships, if it's about the quest for spiritual awakening or whatever it is, there's a theme that is universal. But beyond that, I don't think it's going to mean the same thing to different people. So.
Right. Okay. So you picked a poem to read.
I did. Well, yes. I'm going to go with the first one. I like to start at the beginning when I do readings.
Now, before you read it, how did this poem come to you? You were just at home?
Yeah, I do most of my writing at home.
At a quiet time?
Well, it's not always a quiet time.
Right.
Sometimes I have to just close the door. I have 2 daughters, and
Yeah.
they know when I'm writing and that they need to give me a little space.
No, I mean, let me ask you this: are you maybe doing laundry and all of a sudden something clicks and
I
got to go into my
I
studio?
can be doing almost anything. This morning, I still need to go back. I didn't have time this morning, but on my morning walk, there was something that the words just started to go, and I was like, okay, I have to remember that specific phrase so I can come back to it later, because I know I don't have time right now. So
it normally works that way. It's not like, okay, I got an hour, I'm going to go into my space, and then hope
when I
a
was
poem
writing
comes.
the novel, I did that. I made
Okay.
space each day to write.
So you have to keep a piece of paper and pen
I
around.
do. I always carry a little notebook with me and stuff, or I'll write it on a scrap of paper wherever. I get a lot of inspiration sitting by the river. The Rappahannock is one of my favorite places to
Okay.
write. So.
Okay. And what's
This one I don't remember where I was when I wrote Bound, but it's a theme that people seem to really resonate with, that idea of joy and grief being really united and intertwined. So
Okay.
it's the first one. Grief and joy walk hand in hand. He weeps of endings, she sings of beginnings. His cries bring the night, her melody wakes the dawn. One, they walk the land, bringers of both dew and frost, ever circling, ever in the spiral that leads one back to the other. He greets her always with relief, for she reminds him there is a day beyond this day. She with sadness for the taste of joy soon to be lost. Still they rejoice in each other, hands clasped tightly, grief and joy bound.
I guess I'm not going to say what I mean.
You're welcome to say what it
Yeah,
what it
and
says
again,
to
I guess
you.
that probably says more about me. I mean, obviously, it's a couple with really, really strong ties, that maybe was broken or maybe is not always there.
See, that's
Right.
beautiful. You know,
Right.
I don't want to tell people what it means.
Do you love the people's reaction to that? I mean,
I
just
do.
hearing all the different.
Yeah, because it always means something different to different people. For me, part of the photographs that are part of the book are wrapped up actually both in joy and grief. 9 of the poems in the collection were inspired by the photographs of Joyce Tennyson in a book called Intimacy, and they're photographs of flowers. And the book was gifted to me by a friend who had it gifted to her by a woman who was grieving the loss of her daughter. And this book and these photographs somehow spoke to her and helped her through that grief. And the book eventually got handed down to me, and every time I would open it up, I would write a poem. The flowers just spoke. And I think Joyce Tennyson has this gift for capturing the essence of something in a photograph. And so I started sending the poems to her, and because I like to say thank you for someone who provides inspiration.
So you sent
or
the poems
something.
to Joyce Tennyson?
To Joyce Tennyson, yes. And she would write back, and she really enjoyed them, and we sort of struck up a conversation. And eventually, when I was ready to put this collection together, I asked her if we could use some of the photographs. And so we've used 4 of the photographs to accompany the collection.
Which is interesting because her meanings for them were much different than your
I'm
meanings.
sure they were, yes.
But again, I guess they have some sort of spirit that ties
Universal,
them together.
yeah.
That's interesting. Now, are there any poets? Are you inspired more by things like that, or are you ever inspired by other poets or other writers? Or
Well, I love Mary Oliver's writing. Yes, she inspires me a lot because one of the themes that she writes about that I so enjoy is the natural world, and that's a place where I find a lot of inspiration. So,
do you think there's a big difference between maybe a female poet and a male poet, or is it just person to person? Every poet is a little different.
well, I'm sure there is a difference, but it's so different from poet to poet what they focus on in their writing, what they write about. I loved Claudia Emerson's book, Late Wife, and it was a terror for me to share any of my poetry with her, but early on in the process, she had been at one of the poetry readings, the open mics at the Wounded Bookshop, and so I had read a poem or 2 there, and that was very scary for me to read in front of her. But she offered some really nice feedback afterwards. She was very supportive, and I saw her at the National Festival of the Book last month in DC, and I gave her a copy of Illumine. I was like, I was scared to give it to you. She said, oh, don't be scared. So,
I guess it's nice to get some feedback from another poet.
yeah, well, especially because I don't have that academic background. And so it's a challenge for me to find spaces for that, to get feedback, though I have some friends who are poets, and a friend of mine, Amy, who wrote the article in Front Porch, hosts a poetry salon, so I get to share some there and get some feedback.
Is there two worlds in poetry, like educated or someone that went to school for it or went to school for writing, and then someone who didn't?
You know, I haven't found the world for people who haven't studied it.
Is that right?
And yes, I feel like I don't have my space in the world of poetry because of that. You know, it's not my academic background. I haven't submitted them to a lot of the journals that people submit poetry to and things like that.
How hard is it to stand up in front of a crowd and read your poetry?
It's difficult.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's always difficult.
Is that because it's just difficult to do that, or is it difficult because you feel like you're sharing something intimate with?
Well, yes, a lot of my work comes from a very personal place, though I think people connect with it because of that intimacy in it. But yes, it's very much a sharing of my own heart, and I had to get past that. It's much easier now than it used to be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it gets easier and easier.
It does.
Oh, good. We're going to take one more quick break.
Okay.
We're going to come right back and we'll hear one more of Lynda Allen's poems. We'll be right back with Artscape.